The fastest way to discover who someone really is to give them power and an audience. On a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, both would collide inside one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore cast warm light across polished marble floors, while the soft sound of piano music floated through the room like a whisper. Conversations about acquisitions, investments, and private flights blended with the clink of expensive glassware. It was the kind of place where people measured success in net worth and influence. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables, carrying a silver tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. At 29, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Her black uniform was immaculate. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her expression remained calm, professional, and unreadable. Most guests never looked at her long enough to notice anything else. To them, she was simply the waitress who appeared when needed and disappeared when she wasn't. Claire preferred it that way. The fewer questions people asked, the easier life became. Across the restaurant, however, there was one man nobody could ignore. Ethan Callaway had arrived 20 minutes earlier and already controlled the room without trying. Conversations lowered when he passed. Managers appeared before he requested anything. Investors adjusted their posture when he spoke. At 42, Ethan had built a technology empire worth billions of dollars. Business magazines called him brilliant. Financial networks called him visionary. His competitors called him dangerous. Tonight, he was hosting a private dinner that could finalize a corporate merger valued at nearly $3 billion. 5 executives sat around his table. 2 attorneys reviewed documents. 3 investors listened carefully to every word he said. The atmosphere felt less like dinner and more like a boardroom wrapped in luxury. Claire approached with a bottle of sparkling water. "Would anyone care for a refill?" she asked politely. Most nodded without looking up. Ethan didn't. His attention remained fixed on the documents spread before him. Claire moved efficiently around the table, refilling glasses before stepping back. As she turned to leave, one of the investors accidentally nudged a folder near the edge of the table. Several pages slipped free and scattered onto the floor. Claire instinctively bent down to help. "Leave it," Ethan said sharply. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The entire table immediately fell silent. Claire paused. "Of course, sir," she replied softly. She straightened and stepped back. One of the attorneys quickly gathered the papers instead. The meeting resumed. Claire continued serving nearby tables, but she noticed the tension building around Ethan's group. Numbers were being discussed. Deadlines. Ownership percentages. Regulatory approvals. Every sentence carried the weight of millions of dollars. Then something unexpected happened. One of the investors frowned while reviewing a document. "This section wasn't in the draft from last week," he said. Ethan reached for the contract. His jaw tightened slightly. A brief disagreement followed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to darken the mood. Claire happened to be standing nearby when one page shifted under the restaurant lighting. For the briefest moment, a paragraph became visible. Her eyes caught a phrase. Just a few words. A tiny detail buried inside pages of legal language. Her expression changed. Only slightly. Most people would never have noticed. She immediately looked away. The tray in her hands remained perfectly steady. Ethan looked up and caught the movement. Their eyes met for less than a second. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Several heads turned toward Claire. She hesitated. The room seemed to grow quieter. "No, sir," she answered. "No problem at all." Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he noticed the contract. Then her. Then the contract again. A faint smile appeared on one investor's face. "What is it?" he asked jokingly. "Does our waitress have an opinion on a $3 billion merger?" A few people chuckled. Claire lowered her gaze respectfully. "No, sir." Ethan leaned back in his chair. The amusement vanished from his face. "Good," he said. Then his voice became colder, sharper, the kind of tone that made people instantly remember hierarchy. "Because you should know your place." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. A server froze beside the wine station. Even the piano player seemed quieter for a moment. Claire stood completely still. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the silver tray. Her smile never moved. Her eyes never hardened. She simply nodded once. "Of course, Mr. Callaway," she said. Then she turned and walked away. Calm, professional, unshaken. But as Claire disappeared toward the service corridor, Nobody in that restaurant knew that within the next hour, the billionaire who had just told a waitress to know her place would discover something that would leave an entire room speechless. Claire did not stop walking until the service corridor swallowed the noise of the dining room behind her. The heavy door swung closed with a soft click, muting the piano music and expensive conversations on the other side. For a moment, she stood alone beside a stainless steel counter stacked with polished glasses. Her breathing remained steady. Her expression remained calm. Only the faint pressure of her fingers against the serving tray revealed that the words had landed at all. A younger server named Megan glanced toward her. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Claire offered the same small smile she offered everyone. "I am fine." Megan looked unconvinced but said nothing more. People often mistook Claire's silence for weakness. It was easier that way. Silence required less explanation. 10 years earlier, she would have responded differently. 10 years earlier, Claire Bennett had spent her days inside lecture halls lined with dark oak panels and shelves full of legal textbooks. She had graduated near the top of her class from Columbia Law School. Professors predicted a brilliant future. Recruiters competed for her attention. Corporate law firms offered salaries larger than anything her family had ever imagined. Back then, her name appeared on academic journals. Her research was cited by attorneys twice her age. Partners remembered her after a single meeting. She had been 24 years old and convinced the future was already mapped out in front of her. Then life changed direction. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just one phone call, one hospital visit, one difficult year that became two. Her father, a high school history teacher who had spent his life helping other people, became seriously ill. Medical appointments multiplied. Insurance complications followed. Long commutes between work and treatment centers slowly consumed every hour she had. Opportunities disappeared one by one. Deadlines passed. Promotions went to someone else. Eventually, Claire made a choice that surprised everyone except herself. She stepped away. Temporary, she had told people. Just until things stabilized. They never did. 5 years later, she was still wearing a black apron instead of a tailored suit. Yet strangely, she did not regret it. Life looked different than she expected, but not empty. The restaurant manager pushed through the kitchen doors carrying a tablet. "Table 12 needs another bottle of sparkling water," he said. Then his voice softened. "Do not worry about Mr. Calloway. He can be difficult." Claire nodded. "I know. Most people would have reacted. Most people are not serving dinner," she replied. The manager laughed quietly and returned to the dining room. Claire gathered a fresh bottle and resumed her shift. The evening continued. Orders arrived. Meals were delivered. Glasses were refilled. Around her, Manhattan's wealthy and influential discussed fortunes large enough to transform entire towns. Claire listened without appearing to listen. Years of legal training had left her with a habit she could never fully turn off. She noticed details, patterns, contradictions. Across the room, Ethan's table had grown noticeably tenser. The investors were speaking less. The attorneys were reviewing the same pages repeatedly. One executive rubbed his forehead while reading a particular section of the agreement. Something was bothering them. Claire placed a dessert menu on a nearby table and glanced toward the private dining area again. A document rested partially open beside Ethan's glass. Under the warm chandelier light, a familiar phrase caught her eye. Her attention sharpened. Instantly, the wording looked ordinary to everyone else. It should have. Hidden inside dense legal language, it appeared harmless. But Claire recognized it immediately. Years ago, she had written an entire research paper about contractual control provisions almost identical to that one. Her steps slowed. Her heartbeat did not. She looked away at once. Then she looked back, just for a second, long enough to confirm what she thought she saw. And when she did, a feeling settled quietly in her chest. Not fear, not satisfaction, concern. Because if that clause meant what she believed it meant, someone sitting at Ethan Calloway's table was about to make a very expensive mistake. Claire carried a tray of coffee cups toward a table near the windows, but her attention kept drifting back to the private dining area. The clause she had glimpsed refused to leave her mind. Years ago, she would have highlighted it within seconds. She would have circled it in red, attached a memorandum, and sent it to a senior partner before lunch. Tonight, she was carrying coffee and clearing dessert plates. Yet knowledge did not disappear simply because a person changed uniforms. Across the room, Ethan Calloway sat at the center of the table like the axis around which everything revolved. Investors watched him carefully. Executives measured their words around him. Attorneys deferred to him. Confidence seemed to follow him the way shadows followed light. He had spent 2 decades building that reputation. Every article written about him repeated the same themes: discipline, intelligence, control. Ethan rarely lost. That was why nobody around him seemed willing to challenge anything. Claire noticed it immediately. One attorney glanced at the disputed section twice, frowned, then remained silent. An executive opened his mouth as if to speak and thought better of it. The investors exchanged brief looks before returning their attention to Ethan. The room was full of accomplished people, yet everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to raise a concern. Nobody did. The merger discussion continued. Claire delivered a bottle of mineral water to another table and listened to fragments of conversation drifting through the restaurant. A couple discussed a penthouse purchase. 2 bankers debated interest rates. A family celebrated a college acceptance. Life moved forward in dozens of directions at once. Yet the private dining room remained fixed in her thoughts. She told herself to ignore it. It was not her responsibility. She worked here. The documents belonged to them. The decision belonged to them. The consequences belonged to them. Still, something felt wrong. Near 9 o'clock, Claire entered the kitchen to pick up an order. Steam drifted from the stoves. Chefs moved with practiced precision. Plates emerged beneath warm lights. The familiar rhythm usually helped quiet her thoughts. Tonight it did not. "You seem distracted," Megan said while arranging silverware. "Long night." Claire hesitated. "Something like that." "That billionaire out there?" Megan asked. "Do not tell me you are still thinking about what he said." Claire smiled faintly. "I am not." The answer was technically true. She was not thinking about the insult anymore. She was thinking about the contract. When she returned to the dining room, she saw Ethan standing near the bar speaking with one of the investors. The conversation appeared cordial, but tension lingered beneath the surface. Ethan accepted a glass of sparkling water and glanced toward the dining room. His eyes landed on Claire for a brief moment. There was curiosity there now. Not respect. Not apology. Curiosity. As though he could not quite understand why she had remained so calm. Most people reacted when challenged. Most people became defensive. Claire had done neither. She had simply continued working. Ethan looked away first. Claire returned to her duties. 15 minutes later, one of the attorneys spread several pages across the table again. The same section appeared. The same clause. The same hidden language. Claire felt her stomach tighten. This time she saw more than a single sentence. She saw the structure surrounding it. The references. The cross provisions. The ownership conditions buried beneath layers of legal wording. Suddenly the full picture became clear. Her pace slowed. The tray in her hands felt heavier. Because she no longer suspected a problem. She understood it. And if her interpretation was correct, the agreement Ethan believed would secure his future could eventually place control of his company into someone else's hands. Claire stopped beside an empty table and looked toward the private dining room one more time. The investors were smiling. The attorneys were preparing final copies. Pens had already been placed beside the signature pages. Everything appeared moments away from completion. Yet the certainty on their faces only deepened the concern growing quietly inside her. And for the first time that evening, Claire found herself asking a question she had spent hours avoiding. If she stayed silent and watched a mistake happen, would she truly be minding her own business? Or simply abandoning the truth because it was easier? Claire remained beside the empty table for several seconds after the question formed in her mind. Around her, the restaurant continued exactly as before. Servers carried plates. Glasses clinked softly. The pianist moved into another song. Nobody else seemed aware that a decision was unfolding inside her. She picked up a folded napkin from the table and placed it carefully in her tray. Then she walked away. Not toward Ethan's table. Toward the kitchen. The easiest choice was silence. Silence protected her. Silence kept boundaries intact. Silence prevented embarrassment. More importantly, silence prevented her from stepping into a world she had left behind years ago. She reminded herself of that as she pushed through the kitchen doors. Yet the feeling would not leave. The problem was not Ethan. It was not the insult. It was not even the contract itself. The problem was that she knew something. Once knowledge exists, ignoring it becomes harder than people imagine. A chef called her name. She collected 2 entrees and delivered them to a corner table. She smiled politely. She refilled a glass of iced tea. She cleared an appetizer plate. Every movement remained professional. Every action looked normal. Inside, however, her thoughts kept returning to the same sentence buried inside the merger agreement. The language was elegant. That was what made it dangerous. Whoever drafted it understood exactly what they were doing. A casual reader would never notice. Even experienced attorneys could overlook it if they assumed the surrounding provisions were standard. Claire suspected that was exactly what had happened. The agreement was long, complex, filled with technical language. People often became less careful when documents appeared familiar. Confidence could create blind spots. And confidence was something Ethan Calloway possessed in abundance. When Claire returned to the dining room, she saw signatures being prepared. One attorney organized folders. Another reviewed a checklist. Investors appeared noticeably more relaxed. The hardest part seemed over. At least they believed it was. Ethan stood near the head of the table speaking with a silver-haired executive. The executive laughed at something he said. Ethan smiled politely. Yet Claire noticed a subtle shift in him. He kept glancing toward the contract, toward the attorneys, toward the investors. Something about the evening still bothered him. Success had taught him to trust his instincts. Unfortunately, instincts only helped when someone listened to them. Claire walked past carrying a coffee service tray. As she approached the private dining area, one sheet of paper slid partially off the table. No one noticed. She did. The page drifted toward the floor. Instinctively, she stepped forward and caught it before it landed. The nearest attorney looked up. "Thank you," he said distractedly. Claire handed him the document. Her eyes landed on the page for less than a second, long enough to remove any remaining doubt. She had been right. Completely right. The attorney returned the page to the stack without another glance. Claire continued walking. Her pulse quickened for the first time that evening. Not because she felt nervous, because certainty had arrived. The clause did exactly what she thought it did. The ownership trigger connected to a secondary governance provision buried elsewhere in the agreement. Together, they created a pathway that could eventually transfer controlling authority under specific conditions. Conditions that appeared unlikely now. Conditions that could become very likely later. The trap was not immediate. That was the genius of it. By the time anyone realized what had happened, reversing it would be almost impossible. Claire stopped near the service station. Megan noticed her expression immediately. "You sure you are okay?" she asked. Claire looked toward the private dining room. The signature folders were being opened. Pens were being placed beside them. Final discussions were ending. Time was running out. "I am not sure," Claire admitted quietly. Megan blinked. "About what?" Claire did not answer right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the table where a multi-billion-dollar decision was about to become permanent. Then she set down her tray. Slowly, carefully, like someone placing a fragile object exactly where it belonged. And for the first time all evening, she began walking directly toward Ethan Calloway's table. The conversations around the private dining table softened as Claire approached. Nobody invited her. Nobody expected her. That alone drew attention. Ethan noticed her first. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger this time. With curiosity. The same calm waitress who had quietly walked away earlier was now standing beside a table where billion-dollar decisions were being finalized. One attorney stopped organizing papers. An investor lowered his glass. The silver-haired executive leaned back in his chair. Claire remained composed. "Excuse me, Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was respectful. "Steady. May I have a moment?" Ethan studied her face. The room seemed to wait. "This is not really the best time," one of the attorneys said politely. "I understand," Claire replied. "I will only need a minute." Ethan glanced toward the signature pages, then back at Claire. Something about her expression gave him pause. She was not nervous. She was not trying to impress anyone. She looked like someone carrying information she wished she did not have to share. "Go ahead," Ethan said. The attorney looked surprised. Claire took a careful breath. "I believe there may be an issue in the agreement." Silence followed. Complete silence. Then one investor laughed softly. "An issue," he repeated. "With the contract?" Claire nodded once. "Yes, sir." Another executive exchanged an amused look with his colleague. Ethan did not laugh. "What kind of issue?" he asked. Claire chose her words carefully. "A governance provision tied to an ownership trigger." One attorney immediately frowned. The amusement at the table faded slightly. Legal terminology sounded very different coming from a waitress than most people expected. Ethan leaned forward. You reviewed the agreement? No, sir. Then how would you know that? Claire glanced toward the papers. I recognized some of the language. The silver-haired executive smiled politely. Recognized it from where? Claire hesitated. Research. A brief chuckle moved around the table again. Ethan remained silent. He had spent years evaluating people. He knew confidence when he saw it. Claire was not guessing. That much was obvious. One attorney adjusted his glasses. Which provision concerns you? Claire pointed toward a section near the middle of the document. The secondary authority transfer language connected to the restructuring clause. The attorney opened the agreement and turned pages. His expression changed almost immediately. He found the section. Ethan noticed. So did everyone else. The attorney read silently for several seconds. Then again, slower this time. Another attorney leaned over to see what he was reading. Neither man spoke. The atmosphere shifted. Barely, but enough. Ethan's attention sharpened. What is it? He asked. The first attorney cleared his throat. Nothing serious. Yet he did not sound convinced. Claire remained standing. Respectfully, she said, I think it might become serious. The second attorney took the document and reviewed the language himself. His confidence disappeared even faster. The investors stopped smiling. Ethan's eyes moved from one attorney to the other. Someone explain what is happening. The room stayed quiet. Finally, the second attorney spoke. There appears to be an interpretation issue. Ethan's jaw tightened. An interpretation issue worth delaying a signature? The attorney did not answer immediately. That answer alone said more than words. Could. Claire wished she were somewhere else. She wished she had never seen the clause. She wished she could return to carrying coffee and clearing plates. Instead, she stood beneath the chandelier, while a room full of powerful people reconsidered a deal they had been minutes away from approving. Ethan looked directly at her. How did you catch this? Claire lowered her eyes briefly. I spent a long time studying contracts like these. Studying where? Ethan asked. Before she could answer, one of the attorneys suddenly sat upright. His face had gone pale. Wait, he said quietly. Everyone turned toward him. He pointed to another section deeper in the agreement. Then another. Then a third cross-reference. The room grew still. Completely still. Because for the first time that evening, everyone at the table realized the waitress might not simply be correct. She might have just uncovered something none of them had seen. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence spread beyond the private dining table and seemed to ripple through the surrounding room. Ethan looked from one attorney to the other. Both men were now reading with an intensity that had not existed 10 minutes earlier. One investor slowly lowered his glass. Another adjusted his chair and leaned closer to the documents. The confidence that had filled the table all evening was beginning to crack. Tell me exactly what you found, Ethan said. His voice remained controlled, but the edge underneath it had sharpened. The attorney holding the agreement exhaled slowly. The transfer provision appears to connect to a contingent governance structure. Ethan stared at him. In plain English, the attorney swallowed. If certain performance benchmarks are missed after the merger, voting control could gradually shift. The room became still again. Ethan's expression did not change. That alone worried everyone at the table. People who knew him understood that his calmest moments were often his most dangerous. Gradually shift to whom? He asked. The attorney looked toward a section near the end of the agreement. The acquiring board structure. One investor immediately sat upright. That was never discussed. It is not stated directly, the second attorney replied. That is the problem. Claire remained standing quietly beside the table. She wished she could disappear into the background again. Instead, every eye occasionally drifted back toward her. The waitress, the only person in the room who had noticed the issue before the signatures began. Ethan turned another page. Then another. His movements were deliberate, careful, the kind of patience developed by someone accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars. How much control are we talking about? He asked. Neither attorney answered immediately. The hesitation was enough. Ethan's gaze hardened. How much? Potentially enough to influence board leadership over time. The answer landed heavily. One investor muttered something under his breath. Another rubbed his forehead. The silver-haired executive who had been smiling earlier no longer looked amused. Ethan looked toward Claire. You saw this from a glance. Claire shook her head slightly. Not all of it. Then what? I recognized the language pattern. Ethan studied her face. Language pattern. Certain clauses tend to appear together, Claire explained. When I saw one, I suspected there might be others. One attorney slowly nodded. Reluctantly. She is correct. That admission changed everything. Because now the validation was not coming from Claire. It was coming from professionals whose careers depended on being right. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, he seemed less interested in the contract and more interested in the woman standing beside the table. Who are you? He asked quietly. Claire looked uncomfortable. Just a waitress. Several people around the table exchanged glances. Nobody believed that answer anymore. Ethan certainly did not. No, he said. You are not. Before Claire could respond, one of the attorneys suddenly froze. His eyes widened slightly. He turned several pages backward, then forward again, then backward once more. There is another issue. Every head turned toward him. What now? Ethan asked. The attorney pointed to a section buried deep in the agreement. The language references in academic analysis. Ethan frowned. So, the attorney continued reading. Then he stopped completely. The color drained from his face. That cannot be right. What? Ethan asked. The attorney looked up. His eyes moved directly toward Claire. For a moment, he simply stared. Then he lowered his gaze to the page again, as if hoping he had misread it. He had not. This clause, he said slowly, was modeled after a legal research paper published several years ago. Claire's expression remained calm. Yet something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. The attorney looked back at the document. Then at Claire. Then back again. Do you happen to know a legal scholar named Claire Bennett? The entire table went silent. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Claire did not answer immediately. And somehow that silence revealed far more than any explanation possibly could. The question lingered in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the piano music from the far side of the restaurant seemed distant now. Claire looked at the attorney for a long moment before answering. Yes, she said quietly. The reaction was immediate. One investor blinked in disbelief. Another turned toward her, so quickly his chair shifted against the floor. Ethan's eyes never left her face. You are Claire Bennett? The attorney asked again, as though saying the words twice might somehow change them. Claire nodded once. I am. The attorney stared at her. The Claire Bennett. A faint smile touched her face. Not proud. Not defensive. Just tired. I suppose that depends on which one you mean. The attorney let out a short breath. The Columbia researcher. The one who published the governance transfer analysis that became required reading in several corporate law programs. The silver-haired executive looked stunned. I know that paper. Another attorney nodded immediately. So do I. Ethan said nothing. His expression had become unreadable. Claire glanced down briefly. That was a long time ago. 5 years, the attorney replied. Not that long. Claire folded her hands in front of her. Long enough. The investors looked between her and the documents scattered across the table. The contrast was almost impossible to ignore. A woman wearing a simple black server uniform stood beside a group of executives worth billions of dollars. Yet she was suddenly the most qualified person in the room to discuss the agreement sitting in front of them. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. Nobody else moved. Why are you working here? He asked. The question carried no mockery now. No arrogance. Just genuine confusion. Claire considered the answer. Because life rarely follows the plan we make for it. Ethan waited. She continued. My father became ill. I stepped away from my career to help him. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Opportunities disappeared. Bills did not. Her voice remained calm. Matter of fact. She was not asking for sympathy. She was simply stating facts. The attorney still looked astonished. Do you realize how many firms tried to recruit you after that paper was published? Claire smiled faintly. At the time, yes. And you walked away? Claire looked toward the dining room where other guests continued eating dinner, unaware of the conversation unfolding nearby. Some things matter more than resumes. The answer landed softly, yet it seemed to affect the room more than any legal analysis had. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time that evening, he appeared uncomfortable. Not because of the contract, because memory had returned. He remembered exactly what he had said earlier. He remembered the dismissive tone, the assumption, the certainty. Around the table, several executives appeared to remember it as well. Nobody mentioned it. They did not need to. Silence was doing the work for them. One of the investors cleared his throat. The agreement. Everyone returned their attention to the documents. The attorney nodded quickly. We need a complete review before anything is signed. Agreed, said another. The merger that had seemed moments from completion was now on hold. Ethan looked down at the contract, then back at Claire. If you had not spoken up? The attorney answered before she could. We probably would have approved this exactly as written. Another uncomfortable silence followed. Ethan stared at the pages in front of him. $3 billion. Months of negotiations. Teams of lawyers. Consultants. Analysts. Executives. And the person who caught the flaw had been carrying a tray of coffee less than an hour earlier. Claire stepped back slightly. I should return to work. Nobody stopped her. Nobody knew what to say. As she turned to leave, the attorney suddenly spoke again. There is something else. Claire paused. The attorney tapped the research citation buried deep inside the agreement. The firm that drafted this clause credited the original author. Ethan looked down at the page. Then he read the name printed there. Claire Bennett. And for the second time that night, the billionaire realized he had underestimated the wrong person. Claire took only 2 steps before Ethan's voice stopped her. Wait. The word was not loud, yet it carried through the dining room with surprising clarity. Claire turned slowly. Every person at the table was watching. Several guests at nearby tables had begun paying attention as well. News traveled quickly in places like the Whitmore. A few minutes earlier, she had been invisible. Now she was the center of a conversation nobody expected. Ethan stepped away from the table. The contract remained open behind him. The merger discussion had completely stalled. I owe you a question, he said. Claire looked at him calmly. All right. Ethan folded his arms. Why did you help? Nobody interrupted. The attorneys remained silent. The investors listened carefully. Ethan continued. After everything. Claire understood exactly what he meant. Earlier that evening, he had dismissed her. Publicly. Carelessly. He had assumed he understood who she was based on a uniform and a name tag. Now he wanted to know why she had chosen to protect a deal that belonged to a man who had shown her so little respect. Claire glanced briefly toward the contract, then back at Ethan. Because it was the right thing to do. The answer seemed almost too simple. Ethan frowned slightly. That is it. That is enough. The room fell quiet again. Claire's voice contained no bitterness, no triumph, no hidden accusation. She was not trying to make anyone feel guilty. She was simply telling the truth. One investor shook his head slowly. Most people would not have done that. Claire smiled faintly. Most people probably would not have noticed the clause. A few nervous laughs moved around the table. The tension eased for the first time all evening. Ethan looked down briefly. When he raised his eyes again, something had changed. The certainty that usually surrounded him was gone. In its place was something far less common. Humility. You know, he said quietly. I spent the entire evening believing I was the smartest person in this room. Nobody reacted. Nobody needed to. The statement spoke for itself. Ethan glanced toward the attorneys, then toward the contract. Finally back to Claire. Turns out I was wrong. The admission surprised everyone. Ethan Calloway was known for many things. Public apologies were not one of them. Claire said nothing. She simply listened. Ethan exhaled slowly. That deal could have cost my company control over everything we built. One attorney nodded immediately. It very well might have. Ethan looked at Claire again. And the person who caught it was carrying a tray of coffee. The irony was impossible to ignore. Yet Claire's expression never changed. Jobs tell you what someone does, she said softly. Not who they are. Several people lowered their eyes after hearing that. The words landed harder than criticism ever could. Ethan absorbed them in silence. Across the restaurant, conversations had nearly stopped. Even people who did not know the details sensed that something unusual was happening. The billionaire who normally commanded every room suddenly seemed more interested in listening than speaking. One of the investors stood and extended his hand toward Claire. For what it is worth, thank you. Another followed. Then another. Soon several people around the table were expressing gratitude in their own way. Claire accepted each gesture politely. Nothing more. Nothing less. She never acted as though she had won something. Because in her mind, there had never been a contest. Ethan watched the exchange quietly. Then his gaze returned to the research citation still visible on the contract. Claire Bennett. A name hidden in plain sight. A contribution that had influenced major corporate agreements across the country. A woman whose work had shaped decisions worth billions of dollars while she spent her evenings serving dinner to strangers. Ethan shook his head slowly. There is something I still do not understand. Claire raised an eyebrow. What is that? Ethan looked around the dining room. How someone with your mind disappeared from this world for 5 years. Claire's smile softened. Not sad. Not regretful. Just peaceful. I never disappeared, she said. People just stopped looking beyond the apron. For a moment, nobody responded. Claire's words settled over the room with a quiet weight that no one could ignore. People just stopped looking beyond the apron. The sentence lingered long after she finished speaking. Ethan looked around the dining room. The chandeliers still glowed. The piano still played softly. Guests still occupied their tables. Yet the room felt different now. Earlier that evening, everyone had seen a waitress. Now they saw a person, a history, a sacrifice, a mind. Ethan glanced toward the contract one final time before closing the folder. The sound echoed softly across the table. The signing is postponed, he said. No one argued. No one objected. In fact, several executives appeared relieved. The attorneys immediately began discussing revisions and additional reviews. Investors started making calls. A deal worth billions of dollars would have to wait. Ethan, however, was no longer thinking about the merger. His attention remained fixed on Claire. She stood exactly as before. Calm, professional, unassuming. The remarkable thing was not that she had identified the problem. The remarkable thing was that she had never once used her knowledge to seek recognition. She had not interrupted to prove she was right. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had not demanded respect. She had simply done what she believed was right, and then tried to return to work. Ethan realized how rare that was. In his world, people competed constantly for attention, titles, influence, credit. Yet the person who deserved recognition the most had spent years avoiding the spotlight entirely. He stepped away from the table and walked toward her. The room grew quieter again. Claire noticed, but remained composed. Ethan stopped a few feet away. Then, in front of investors, attorneys, executives, restaurant staff, and dozens of guests, he did something nobody expected. Claire, he said, I owe you an apology. The dining room became completely silent. Ethan Calloway was a man whose opinions moved markets, a man who rarely admitted mistakes. Yet there he stood, speaking without pride and without excuses. Earlier tonight, I looked at your uniform and assumed I understood your value. He paused briefly. I was wrong. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Ethan continued. You protected my company from a mistake I did not see. You helped people who did not deserve your help. And you did it with more grace than I showed you. Claire held his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes. Only kindness. Thank you, she said softly. Ethan nodded once. Then he surprised everyone again. He reached for a chair at the table where the merger discussions had been taking place and pulled it out. Not dramatically, not for attention, simply as a gesture of respect. If you ever decide you want to return to law, he said, there will be opportunities waiting. Claire smiled. A genuine smile this time. I appreciate that. You earned it. Claire glanced around the room. At the executives, the attorneys, the staff members watching from the service station. Then she looked back at Ethan. Maybe, she said quietly, but tonight was never about earning respect. Ethan tilted his head slightly. No. Claire shook her head. Respect should not have to be earned through extraordinary moments. People deserve basic respect long before anyone discovers what they can do. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier silences. Warmer, thoughtful. Several people lowered their eyes. Others nodded almost imperceptibly, because everyone understood the truth in her words. Ethan smiled faintly. I think that may be the most valuable lesson I learned all year. A few minutes later, Claire returned to work. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, delivered desserts. The same task she had been doing before any of this happened. Yet something had changed. Not in her, in everyone else. People greeted her differently, listened more carefully, looked a little longer. And as the evening drew to a close and the lights of Manhattan shimmered beyond the restaurant windows, one simple truth remained. Some people wear expensive suits. Some people wear aprons. But character has never cared about either one. And the people who seem ordinary are often carrying stories, sacrifices, and strengths that the world would never see unless it first learned to look beyond appearances.